The night before my wedding, I stood alone in the kitchen, watching the ring on my finger catch the dim yellow light like it was trying to warn me of something. The house was too still, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels intentional, like someone pressed pause on the life you were so sure you'd rebuilt. I kept listening for footsteps from my children's rooms, hoping for a door to open, a breath, a sign that they would come around. But the only sound that answered me was the hum of the refrigerator, steady and indifferent, as if even the house had stepped back from me. I live in a modest, sun-softened neighborhood where the evenings smell of jasmine and old fences, and where people walk their dogs at the same time every day because routine feels like safety. After my first marriage ended and my second love slipped through my fingers years later, I learned to build my life slowly, quietly, piece by piece. My children, Adil and Sana, grew into the kind of adults who watch over me with the seriousness of people who've already seen too much loss. And when I told them I had found someone kind again, Elias, with his gentle voice and a patience that felt like shelter, it was as though the air inside our home shifted. The days grew heavier, conversations thinner, and each sunrise felt like it carried a question I wasn't ready to answer. The wedding approached like a soft drumbeat in the background, but the tension in the house rose louder than anything I could silence. Before we go further into this story, if quiet, emotional journeys like this one resonate with you, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the channel. Stories find their meaning when they're shared. I remember the light that afternoon more vividly than the words themselves. A soft, slanting glow spilling through the dining room window like it was trying to warm a moment already doomed to grow cold. I had placed the ring box on the table not with ceremony but with a quiet hope, the kind that trembles even before anyone speaks. Adil sat across from me, arms folded, his expression unreadable, while Sana leaned against the doorway like someone preparing to flee. I tried to smile, though my face felt strangely heavy, as if the news I carried had already decided its own fate. When I told them Elias had proposed and I'd said yes, the room didn't erupt, the silence did. Adil's reaction came first. A slow tightening of his jaw before his voice followed, measured in tone but sharp at the edges in ways he probably didn't mean. He asked why I was choosing to step into the same fire twice, as though marriage itself had proven a curse I refused to learn from. His words weren't shouted, yet they carried the weight of someone who had quietly prepared them long before today. Sana didn't speak at all. She only stared at the ring, then at me, as if I'd betrayed some unspoken pact. When she finally turned and walked out, her footsteps were soft, but they felt louder than anything Adil had said. For a moment I sat very still, watching the way the sunlight caught the metal of the ring, turning it into something both beautiful and accusatory. It was strange how quickly the air in the room shifted, how warmth could vanish without anyone raising their voice. I tried to gather my thoughts, but all I felt was the familiar ache of being misunderstood by the two people I had spent decades trying to protect. The silence between us stretched like an old wall waiting to crack. I asked Adil quietly if he wanted to understand why I said yes, but he only pressed his lips together and looked away. He said he remembered how badly I'd been hurt before, how he and Sana had been forced to grow up faster because the adults around them were too busy breaking. His voice softened then, but the softness hurt more, because it came from a place of fear rather than anger. He didn't believe anyone could love me without eventually tearing pieces away, and hearing that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't prepared for. I knew he meant love, even, but his love felt like a cage built from old memories. I wanted to tell him I wasn't the same woman who once cried into kitchen towels just to keep her sobs from waking them. But before I could form the words, Adil stood up and pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping across the floor with a long, tired sound. He wasn't storming off. He was retreating, the way someone withdraws from a cliff's edge they never asked to stand on. He said he needed time, but time was the one thing I didn't know how to give without losing something else in the process. When he left the room, I felt the temperature drop as though he had taken the last bit of warmth with him. The house felt suddenly enormous, like an attic stuffed with memories that no longer belonged to the present. I reached for the ring and closed my hand around it, holding it so tightly the edges pressed into my skin. I wasn't questioning my love for Elias. Love was the one part that felt certain, but I did question whether I had the right to ask my children to accept a future they didn't trust. The thought settled in my chest like dust, old and familiar, reminding me of every promise I'd ever made to them during the difficult years. I wondered whether they saw this marriage as a betrayal of those promises, or if it stirred something deeper they couldn't yet name. Either way, their silence cut deeper than their words. I stood and walked toward the hallway, pausing at Santa's closed door, listening to the faint sound of her shifting inside. She used to run to me for explanations, for comfort, for answers I never always had. But now she hid from the possibility that I could choose something or someone she couldn't control. I knocked once, gently, but she didn't respond, and I didn't push. There are moments when mothers learn the hard truth that their children's pain has grown beyond their reach. I whispered through the door anyway, telling her I loved her. Though the words felt too small for the heaviness in the air, back in the dining room, I sat again, staring at the two empty chairs as though they held versions of my children I could no longer reach. I tried to imagine how they saw me. A woman who'd been hurt, healed, and was now foolish enough to risk the wound reopening. Maybe to them, love was a thing that belonged to younger people, not to mothers who had already used up too many chances. That thought stung more than I expected, because I had spent years convincing myself I didn't need anyone. Yet here I was, asking them to accept that I wanted someone anyway. A part of me wanted to defend myself, to justify my choices with long explanations and carefully chosen words. But another part understood that explanations wouldn't fix anything today. Fear doesn't dissolve because someone proves it wrong. What my children needed wasn't logic, it was reassurance that my heart wasn't making decisions out of loneliness or nostalgia. I wished they could see how quiet and steady Elias's presence had become in my life. How gently he fit into the spaces I once thought were permanently broken. But wishes don't walk into rooms and change conversations. As the afternoon shifted into early evening, the house felt heavier than before, filled with a silence that didn't want to be solved. I gathered the ring box, closed it, and held it against my palm, letting the coolness of the metal ground me. Part of me wondered if this was a sign I should pause, reconsider, or wait until they were ready. But another part, quieter, steadier, reminded me that happiness rarely arrives in perfect timing. I had spent too many years living in fear of disappointing the people I loved. When the last of the daylight faded, and the walls dimmed into soft shadows, I whispered the question that had been circling my mind from the moment Sana walked out. What if they were right? What if love was another doorway to heartbreak I was too hopeful to recognize? Yet as I placed the ring back on my finger, I felt something else, to a fragile, determined pulse of belief. Maybe I wasn't asking them to understand today. Maybe I was asking myself to try again tomorrow. I chose a cafe far from our neighborhood, somewhere tucked between a closed stationery shop and an old tailor, whose window threads were fading under the sun. The place smelled like roasted almonds and rain-soaked wood, even though the clouds hadn't opened yet. Elias was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, his back straight, his hands folded neatly as though he were preparing for an exam no one told him how to pass. He looked up when I entered, offering me the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the first sign that he knew something had shifted, something he couldn't name yet. I sat across from him, smoothing my scarf even though it didn't need smoothing, giving my hands something to do while I gathered the courage to speak. He asked how the children were, voice light, polite, too hopeful for the answer I carried. I hesitated, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because saying it aloud made it feel heavier. When I finally told him they refused to meet him, I kept my gaze fixed on the tabletop, tracing a small scratch in the wood with my fingertip. The silence that followed was soft, but it settled between us like a folded blanket of disappointment. Elias didn't ask why not immediately. Instead, he wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, absorbing its warmth like someone trying to steady himself after stepping into cold water. When he finally lifted his eyes to mine, they held a calmness that wasn't quite real, a quiet resistance against the hurt curling at the edges. He said he understood, that children protect what they fear losing, and that maybe this was their way of holding on. But even as he spoke, his fingers tightened around the mug as if bracing against something unseen. I wished I could offer comfort, yet the truth was I didn't fully understand their refusal either. Outside, the clouds thickened, blurring the light and dimming the street like evening had arrived early. I watched a man hurry past holding a newspaper over his head, preparing for rain that hadn't yet begun. The moment reminded me of myself, always bracing for storms long before the first drop fell. Elias followed my gaze, then gently asked if I wanted to talk about it. His tone was steady, but the edges of his words trembled with a question he didn't want to force on me. I told him I didn't know where to begin, because everything I said felt like choosing sides I didn't want to choose. He leaned back slightly, giving me space, though the act itself felt like another small hurt. I told him Adil thought I was repeating old patterns and that Sana couldn't bring herself to even look at the ring. Saying their reactions aloud made the moment feel more real, like confessing a truth that had been hiding beneath my ribs. Elias nodded slowly, absorbing each word with a quiet patience that both comforted and pained me. He asked if I believed their fears had merit, but the question wasn't accusatory, it was careful, searching. I didn't know how to answer, so I let the silence linger until it became part of the conversation. The cafe filled with the soft clinking of cups, the shuffle of people passing behind us, the murmur of conversations that weren't ours. I noticed how Elias sat with his shoulders slightly bowed, as though the weight of my children's rejection had settled there without his permission. He said he didn't want to force himself into their lives, that he was willing to wait until they were ready. But the gentleness in his voice made the waiting feel heavier, not lighter. I wanted to reach across the table and rest my hand on his, but something held me back, maybe guilt, maybe fear. He noticed the hesitation, though he didn't mention it. The first drop of rain hit the window, sliding down the glass like an unanswered question. Then more followed, soft at first, then steady enough to blur the reflections of passing cars. The world outside the cafe grew muted, softened by water and distance, mirroring the uncertainty swelling in my chest. Elias watched the rain with a quiet sigh, then turned to me with a small, weary smile. He asked if I believed we could navigate this storm together, but the question lodged in my throat before I could answer. I wanted to say yes, wanted it so deeply, but doubt hovered like a shadow at my back. I told him I would fix things, that I just needed time to help the children understand. The promise felt fragile the moment it left my mouth, like a thread stretched too thin between two heavy stones. Elias nodded, though the acceptance in his gesture felt more like resignation than hope. He said he trusted me, even if he didn't trust the circumstances, and I felt that truth settle somewhere deep, somewhere tender. I wondered if love could withstand the strain of waiting, the way a bridge withstands to many years without repair. The thought frightened me more than I wanted to admit. When I stood to leave, Elias didn't rise immediately. He watched me gather my bag, watched the raindrops drip from the awning outside, watched everything except the fear forming behind his own eyes. When he finally stood, he touched my arm gently, a touch that asked nothing and offered everything. He said he'd be there when I needed him, though he wasn't sure how to stand close without feeling like an intruder in my life. I didn't know how to reassure him without lying, so I simply nodded, hoping the gesture carried more truth than my unspoken worries. As I stepped into the rain, the chill startled me, clinging to my clothes and skin like a warning I tried to ignore. I walked slowly, letting the water soak through my scarf, letting the sound of it drown out the noise inside my mind. Behind me, I felt rather than saw Elias standing near the cafe door, watching, waiting, wondering if love could survive the spaces my children had carved into our lives. I didn't turn around, I couldn't. The rain masked my tears before they could fall, and the question echoed quietly beneath it all. Could something so gentle stand firm when its foundation was already cracking? The house shifted in ways only I seemed to notice, as if it had begun exhaling less and listening more. There were mornings when I walked into the kitchen and found the air thick with a kind of quiet that didn't belong to a home but to a waiting room where no one wanted to be the first to speak. Adil left earlier than usual for work, offering short nods instead of conversation, his footsteps quick, precise, almost startled. Sana lingered in her room, emerging only when necessary, her presence soft but distant, like someone passing through a museum they no longer cared for. Even the floorboards creaked differently, as if remembering a livelier rhythm from a time none of us could return to. I moved around the house like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, doing small chores to fill the spaces once held by laughter or the sound of shared meals. The laundry basket became my quiet companion, each folded shirt a reminder of how much they had grown and how far away they now stood. I watered the plants even when the soil didn't need it, rearranging vases, smoothing curtains, straightening picture frames with hands that needed to keep busy. These tasks felt like whispering apologies to walls that didn't ask for any. I wondered whether the effort was for them or for myself, a way to pretend the house hadn't begun shrinking around the silence. Dinner became an echo of what it once was, a table set for three but occupied by one. Adil texted around 6 each evening, saying he had deadlines, meetings, something that couldn't wait. I knew he was working harder than he needed to, using the office as a refuge from the questions he didn't want to answer. Sana drifted in later, taking her plate to her room with a soft, distant apology that never reached her eyes. I sat alone at the table, the ticking clock sounding louder, counting down moments I didn't know how to fix. The food grew cold beside me, untouched and unnecessary. Every night I paused outside Santa's door, listening for signs she might want to talk, some small opening in the heavy quiet that wrapped itself around her. Sometimes I heard the soft scratch of her pen on paper, other times the faint murmur of her favorite shows, muffled so I couldn't tell if she was laughing or crying. I knocked gently now and then, but the pauses before her replies grew longer, like she was choosing whether to let me in or protect herself from being hurt again. When she said, "I'm fine," it carried the weight of a wall she wasn't ready to lower. I stood there, feeling like the door separated more than just rooms, it separated whole versions of ourselves. Adil's distance was different, sharper around the edges, as though he had wrapped himself in armor made of busyness and practicality. He asked about bills, schedules, grocery lists, anything that kept the conversation factual, safe, and touched by emotion. He never asked about Elias, but his silence spoke louder than any objection could. I watched him from the hallway some nights, the glow from his laptop outlining the way he slumped just slightly, carrying tension in his shoulders he pretended not to feel. He was trying to protect me in his own way, even if that protection felt like punishment. Sometimes I wished he would just say he was scared. The house itself seemed to sense the unrest, holding its breath each time we crossed paths. The living room, once a soft haven of warmth and routine, felt strangely formal, like a place reserved for guests rather than family. Even the chairs seemed to lean away from one another, leaving gaps where closeness used to sit comfortably. The light coming through the windows dimmed earlier, or maybe the shadows just grew faster than I expected. I found myself whispering to the space now and then, reassuring it more than the people inside it. The quiet had settled deep into the walls, and I wondered whether any of us knew how to lift it. In the evenings, after attempting a dinner no one joined, I sat by the window with a cup of tea that cooled faster than I could drink it. The street outside remained unchanged, familiar faces walking their dogs, children playing, the world continuing without hesitation. Yet inside our home, time felt stretched and fragile, each minute slipping into the next with careful steps. I thought about Elias then, his gentle patience, the way he never needed me to be anything more than myself. But thinking of him only highlighted the distance between what I wanted and what my children feared. I pressed my forehead against the cool window, feeling the ache settle deeper. I tried to speak with them, tried in small, hesitant attempts that never quite found their footing. I rehearsed conversations in my mind, sentences that blended understanding with honesty, but they never came out the way I intended. One night, when Adil walked through the door with tired eyes, I asked if we could talk. He paused, looking at me with a cautious tenderness, but shook his head and said he wasn't ready. The words landed gently but carried the force of a closed door all the same. I nodded, pretending it wasn't the answer I feared most. All the while, a quiet fear grew inside me, one that I tried to ignore in the dim glow of my bedside lamp. I feared losing their trust, the bond we had built during years when the world felt too heavy for just 3 people to carry. Yet another fear tangled with it, a fear of losing a chance at joy I had almost given up on, a joy I had found unexpectedly, like a light slipping through a crack. I wondered whether wanting both made me selfish. The question sat in my chest at night, heavy and unanswerable. And beneath all of it, a sharper question took shape, forming from the quiet, from the distance, from the spaces between our conversations. When did my happiness become something they feared rather than celebrated? What shift turned my choices into threats rather than steps forward? I stared at the ceiling some nights, tracing the shadows as if they held answers my children couldn't give. The house kept its silence, offering no reassurance, only reflection. I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness, wondering if love, both theirs and mine, could survive the stillness we had all surrendered to. There are memories that sleep quietly for years, and then there are the ones that wake without warning, walking through your mind as if they never left. Lately, whenever I looked at my children's faces, those older memories began stirring, soft at first, then loud enough to drown out the present. I remembered the day I left their father, a day carved into my life with lines that never faded. The air was heavy with humidity and dread, and the children were too small to understand why their mother was carrying a suitcase instead of her usual calm. Their tiny hands wrapped around my legs, trembling in fear of a world being rearranged. I can still feel the weight of their grip, The way their fingers dug into my skirt as though holding me could stop the unraveling. Sana had cried into my knee, her voice breaking in tiny, breathless sobs, while Adil stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes that asked questions I didn't yet know how to answer. I told them I wasn't leaving them, only leaving the house, but the words felt fragile even as they left my mouth. They didn't understand the difference. To them, goodbye sounded the same no matter how I phrased it. I carried that guilt with me for years, tucked into the quiet spaces of motherhood. The years that followed were fragile in ways only single mothers understand. Every morning was a balancing act between strength and exhaustion, between building a new life and holding together the pieces of the old one. I remember making lists, grocery lists, budget lists, promises to myself lists, because structure felt like the only thing that could keep our world from collapsing again. I cooked meals that didn't always taste right, helped with homework I barely understood, and wiped away tears I didn't always cause. The house was small, our worries large, but there was love in every corner, stitched quietly into our days. I offered them promises that I would never choose pain again, that they wouldn't have to watch me break the way they had once witnessed. Those promises were made in the dim glow of bedside lamps, whispered over tangled blankets and soft prayers. I see now that those promises became rules in their minds, unwritten laws they carried into adulthood. They held them closer than I realized, using them as shields against anything that threatened our version of family. Elias wasn't the threat they saw, he was the unexpected question to a promise they never wanted me to revisit. The more I tried to understand their resistance to him, the more I found myself drifting back into old memories I believed I had outgrown. It wasn't him they feared, it was the possibility of losing the version of me they had worked so hard to keep safe. They couldn't separate this new love from the pain of the past. To them, love had always come with casualties. I began to see each of their reactions as echoes of that first goodbye, reverberating through the years in ways none of us had anticipated. I wished I had known earlier how deeply those echoes had settled into their hearts. Yet the past, softened by time, still carried its shadows, stretching long and thin across the path I was trying to walk. I stood in front of the mirror some evenings, searching for the woman I used to be and the one I was trying to become. The lines around my eyes told stories of survival, but the softness in my gaze held a quieter truth, one of longing, not fear. I didn't want to be bound by a version of myself I had already outgrown. And still, guilt crept in like dusk, blurring the edges of the future I hoped for. One night, I sat on the edge of my bed, hands folded tightly in my lap, replaying every argument, every silence, every moment my children recoiled from my happiness. Their fear was not a weapon but a wound, one that had never fully scarred. They were trying to protect me in the only way they knew how, even if it meant withholding acceptance. That realization softened something inside me, even as it broke another part open. I understood then that love, in their eyes, was a fragile thing always on the verge of breaking. I thought of Elias during those moments, of the steadiness in his voice, the way he waited without pushing, the way he loved without demanding. He wasn't stepping into my past. He was offering a place in his present. But my children couldn't see that, yet they were still standing at the doorway of a house we'd left long ago, afraid that stepping forward meant stepping into uncertainty again. I wished I could bring them into my heart for a moment, let them see how calm it felt with him there. Love wasn't an echo this time. It was something new, still growing, still learning its shape. I found myself caught in a space between then and now, between being the woman who survived her first goodbye and the woman who wanted to choose joy again. The divide felt wide some days, narrow on others, but always present. I wanted to step across it, to embrace the life waiting for me on the other side. Yet I couldn't ignore the hands reaching out behind me, hands that once clung to me in fear. How do you tell your children that you're not abandoning the promises you made, but expanding them into something softer, something alive? And in the quiet hours before dawn, lying awake beneath the weight of old shadows, a question formed with a gentleness that startled me. How do you convince the people you love that yesterday is not a place you live anymore? How do you help them see you as someone who deserves more than survival? The question lingered in the air, delicate as breath, heavy as memory. I closed my eyes, touched the ring on my finger, and whispered a hope that felt both brave and uncertain. Maybe the first person I needed to convince wasn't them, maybe it was myself. I started preparing dinner hours earlier than necessary, moving through the kitchen with a careful rhythm, as though the right sequence of motions could coax harmony back into the house. The scent of simmering spices filled the air, warm and familiar, wrapping the space in a comfort none of us had felt for weeks. I laid out the plates slowly, giving each one the softness of my attention, hoping it would matter. And then, almost without thinking, I placed an extra plate at the table, a small gesture, a quiet hope that maybe tonight would be different. The empty chair beside it felt expectant, like it was listening for footsteps that might never come. When Adil arrived first, he stepped into the dining room and scanned the table with attention he didn't bother hiding. His eyes lingered on the extra plate, the subtle tightening of his jaw confirming he understood exactly who it was meant for. He asked if Elias was joining us, though the tone told me it wasn't a question but a warning dressed as one. I told him gently that I didn't know, that I had simply wanted to create space for peace. Adil shook his head, a soft exhale leaving his chest like a door closing slowly. Sana appeared moments later, her expression mirroring the same guarded hesitation her brother carried, as if they had rehearsed their entrance together. She looked at the table, then at me, and her disappointment settled into the room like dust falling in sunlight. She said they wouldn't stay, not if I intended to blend to worlds they weren't ready to accept. Her words were delivered quietly, without anger, but they still stung sharper than anything loud could have. She took a step back, as though distancing herself from the plate. From the idea, from me. I stood there, hands resting on the back of a chair, feeling the warmth of the food fading in alignment with the warmth in the room. I told them I had invited them tonight because I wanted conversation, not confrontation, but the words barely reached them. Adil said it wasn't the right time, that he needed space to process what my choices meant. Sana nodded, eyes glistening with unspoken fear rather than disdain, and before I could find another word to bridge the moment, they both turned away, their departure quiet but deeply final. When the door closed behind them, the house seemed to reshape itself around the silence, settling deeper into the space they'd left behind. I sat at the table, feeling the coolness of the chair through the thin fabric of my clothes, the room suddenly too large for just one person. The empty seat across from me, Elias's seat, became a quiet witness to everything that wasn't said. I lifted my fork, forcing myself to eat even though every bite tasted like disappointment. The scrape of metal against ceramic echoed in the room, soft but unbearably loud in the stillness. For a moment, I reached for my phone, thumb hovering above the screen as I considered calling Elias. I imagined his voice, warm and patient, asking how dinner had gone, offering comfort I wasn't sure I deserved. But the thought of telling him what happened, how clearly my children had rejected the idea of him, felt like adding weight to a burden he never asked to carry. My hand retreated, setting the phone aside with a reluctance that settled into my chest. The urge to speak to him clashed painfully with the need to protect him from the truth. The food on the table remained mostly untouched, each dish cooling into a muted reminder of what tonight was supposed to be. I gathered it slowly, transferring spoonfuls back into their containers, the sound of the lid snapping shut punctuating the quiet like small, resigned sighs. The kitchen, once warm with anticipation, now felt like a stage after a play that never happened. I washed the dishes in steady motions, trying to anchor myself in routine, but the suds felt too light, the water too warm, my reflection in the window too tired. Even the faucet's steady rush sounded like a question I couldn't answer. When I stepped back into the dining room, the table looked emptier than before, the extra plate still sitting there untouched, a symbol of everything unsaid. I picked it up last, holding it for a moment longer than the others, as though it carried a heartbeat of something I wasn't ready to put away. Placing it back in the cabinet felt like an admission I didn't want to make, that hope had been set aside for the night, maybe for longer. I stood there for a long moment, the quiet stretching around me like a blanket woven from doubt. My heart felt heavy with truths I hadn't shared and fears I couldn't untangle. Later, as I walked down the hallway, I paused by each door. Adil's room, still neat and untouched from his childhood. Sana's door closed tightly as always. I tried to listen for something, movement, breath, a softening, but there was nothing, only the sound of my own footsteps echoing back at me. The house felt both familiar and foreign, like walking through a memory that no longer fit. I pressed my hand against the wall, grounding myself with its solidity. I wondered when the walls had learned to hold so much silence. Before bed, I sat on the edge of my mattress and let the exhaustion settle into my bones, heavy and unavoidable. I replayed the evening over and over, searching for a moment I could have changed, a word I could have chosen differently, but every version ended the same way, with an empty seat, a full table, and two children standing at the edge of their fears. My resolve flickered, uncertain whether it was softening or hardening into something new. And as I lay back and stared at the ceiling, One question pressed into the quiet like a whisper I couldn't escape. Why does choosing love feel so much like choosing loneliness? The evening light settled low over the backyard, painting everything in soft gold and fading blue. The kind of light that makes even broken things look gentle for a moment. I stood near the rose bushes with a small watering can, watching the wilted petals bow under their own weight. The soil felt dry beneath my fingertips, flaking into small breaths of earth that carried the scent of neglect. I watered them slowly, more out of habit than hope, unsure whether they had any life left to save. Behind me, the screen door creaked open, and I heard Sana step out quiet, hesitant, like someone entering a memory rather than a garden. She didn't speak at first, simply watching me from a distance, her presence lingering like a question she wasn't ready to voice. The air between us held an old tension, something fragile but stubborn, like a thread stretched too tightly. When she finally walked closer, her footsteps softened by the grass. She kept her arms folded across her chest as though protecting something fragile inside herself. I continued watering the bushes, giving her room to choose her moment. It came as a whisper before she could change her mind. I don't want to see you break again. I turned toward her, setting the watering can down, surprised not by her words but by the tremor behind them. Sana's face, usually so composed, had softened at the edges, her eyes clouded with memories she didn't know how to forget. She told me she remembered everything: the nights she found me crying quietly, the mornings I forced smiles, the years spent stitching myself back together while pretending the seams didn't show. She said she was tired of being strong for me, tired of holding her breath every time someone new entered my life. Her voice cracked just enough to reveal the child inside her who never truly healed. I listened without interrupting, letting her pour out the fears she had swallowed for far too long. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, fingers grazing the petals of a rose that crumbled under her touch. She said she didn't know how to trust love, not mine, not anyone's, because love had been a door that led to chaos, confusion, and nights where we all felt lost. I watched her stare at the dying rosebushes as though they were metaphors she couldn't avoid. Somewhere in her voice lived the small girl who once clung to my leg as we left her father behind, and hearing her now made that memory ache all over again. When she finally fell silent, I bent down and brushed soil from my palms, letting the dirt slip away like something I could finally release. I told her softly that this love what I had with Elias did not carry the same storms of the past. I told her it was quieter, gentler, the kind that didn't demand we brace ourselves. I could see the doubt flicker in her eyes, like she wanted to believe me but didn't know how to trust her own hope. I reminded her that wounds could shape us without defining what came next. The breeze moved lightly through the branches, carrying the scent of night blooming somewhere nearby. Sana leaned against the old wooden fence, her shoulders sinking as though she'd been holding up the sky for weeks. She said it terrified her to watch me choose something she couldn't control, something that might steal away the small sense of stability she'd built. I reached for her hand, and though she hesitated at first, she didn't pull away. Her fingers felt cold in mine, as if she'd been holding onto fear more tightly than warmth. I told her she didn't need to protect me from my own heart anymore, but even as I said it, I knew the truth was more complicated for both of us. The backyard seemed to shift as we stood there, the silence less sharp now, more like a breath that had been waiting to be released. The half-grown roses around us looked fragile but alive, a reminder that not everything broken stays that way. Sana's gaze lingered on them, and I could tell she was searching not for the flowers themselves, but for meaning hidden in the way life sometimes returns quietly. She whispered that she wasn't angry at Elias, just afraid of what choosing him meant for us as a family. Her honesty was a soft crack in the wall she had built. I squeezed her hand gently, telling her that love wasn't a replacement but an addition, something I didn't expect her and Adil to accept overnight. Her breathing steadied, though uncertainty still shadowed her expression. She said she needed time, and the simplicity of that truth felt like a gift rather than a delay. I nodded, letting her know time was something I was willing to give all of us. The roses trembled lightly as a breeze moved through, scattering a few dry petals across the soil. Together we stood there, surrounded by blooms in different stages, some dying, some clinging to life, some just beginning. The garden looked like a reflection of us, a mix of endings and beginnings coexisting in the same small patch of earth. Sana leaned her head briefly against my shoulder, not quite an apology, not quite surrender, just closeness in a moment that needed it. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of her touch settle inside me. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was no longer rejection. As dusk deepened into evening, casting the backyard in dusky violet shades, Sana whispered that she still didn't know if she could trust this new chapter. Her voice carried the weight of old wounds still pulsing beneath the surface, and I knew healing wouldn't happen all at once. I looked at the roses, at the fragile blooms trying to push through their wilt, and wondered the same thing. Could something new survive when the past hadn't finished aching? I held my daughter's hand tighter, feeling the question settle between us like a soft, uncertain promise. The late afternoon light stretched long across the driveway, turning everything a muted amber as I followed the sound of faint scraping coming from the garage. The door was half open, the space inside lit only by a single dangling bulb that flickered now and then like it couldn't decide whether to stay awake. Adil sat on a low stool, hunched over an old wooden chair, the same one his father used to sit in while reading the newspaper every morning. His hands moved with slow intent, sanding the worn edges as though smoothing them might smooth something in himself. The air felt heavy with memory, like we had both stepped into a room time hadn't finished haunting. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the way his shoulders tightened each time the sandpaper passed over the wood. He didn't look up, but I knew he sensed me there. The slight pause in his rhythm gave him away. I walked closer, keeping my steps soft, careful not to disturb whatever fragile balance he was clinging to. The scent of sawdust filled the air, earthy and sharp, stirring pieces of a past neither of us fully knew how to speak about. When I finally broke the silence, my voice sounded smaller than I intended, like it belonged to a mother afraid to startle her own child. "You've been working on that chair for days," I said gently. He didn't answer right away, continuing to sand the same corner until the grain began to blur beneath his touch. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost swallowed by the hum of the bulb above us. He said the chair had been loose for years, that he should have fixed it long ago, but somehow never found the right moment. I knew immediately that he wasn't talking about the chair, not really. There was something in the tension around his jaw, in the way he wouldn't look directly at me, that made the truth press against the air like a pulse. I stepped closer, resting my hand lightly on the workbench beside him. I stood there, feeling the weight of all their fears, all their protective instincts, all the love that had tangled itself into walls none of us had learned to lower. I looked toward the door where Elias had stood moments before, and the question slipped into the stillness around us. Had that moment brought us any closer to healing, or had it only deepened the divide we were struggling to cross? The days leading up to the ceremony felt strangely hollow, as though time had begun moving in a softer, muted rhythm. I woke each morning with a quiet ache beneath my ribs, the kind that comes from hope rubbing against reality. The to-do list sat on the kitchen counter, handwritten in my looping script, each task neatly checked off except the ones that mattered most. I arranged flowers that would sit on tables my children might never see, selecting soft whites and pale blush tones in hopes they would bring calm to the room. But even the petals felt heavy, as though they understood the celebration was already missing something essential. I finalized the seating plan alone at the dining table, the same table where their refusal had first taken shape. Each empty line where my children's names should have been stared back at me like quiet accusations. I placed them tentatively near the front, just in case they changed their minds, a foolish spark of hope I couldn't quite extinguish. Elias asked gently if we should leave their seats out to spare me the ache, but I shook my head. Leaving them off felt like surrender, and I wasn't ready for that, not yet. Hope, even fragile hope, is still hope. The guest list was small, trimmed down to the handful of people who had remained through the years of rebuilding: neighbors, old friends, a cousin who never stopped calling even when life grew complicated. Each invitation had been met with warm congratulations, but each expression of joy also sharpened the contrast between what I had and what I longed for. Elias hovered at the door as I sealed the last envelope, his eyes soft with concern. He suggested we postpone, just for a few weeks, to give the children time to adjust. But the thought of waiting again felt like placing my life on pause indefinitely, waiting for approval that might never come. I told him gently that I couldn't keep asking permission to move forward, not even from the people I loved most. He nodded, but the sadness in his expression settled into the room like a quiet shadow. Elias had never wanted to be the cause of division, yet every step toward the ceremony seemed to widen the space between worlds he hoped would blend. He reached for my hand, hesitant but sincere, and I felt the warmth of his fingers weaving into mine. I knew he was giving me every chance to pull back, every opportunity to reconsider, but I also knew I would regret giving fear more power than love. The night before the wedding, I laid my dress across the bedspread, a soft, simple fabric that shimmered like frost in the lamplight. I smoothed every crease with a tenderness that felt ceremonial, my hands gliding over the fabric as if it held all the questions I couldn't speak aloud. When I slipped it on, just to see, the mirror reflected a version of me that startled me, a woman both younger and older, hopeful and uncertain, fragile and brave. My breath caught in my throat as I studied my own eyes, searching for something steady in their reflection. I whispered into the stillness that love didn't need unanimous approval to be real, but even as the words left my lips, a tremor of doubt followed them. I thought of Adil's clenched jaw, Santa's clouded gaze, the silent distance that had woven itself between us in recent weeks. I wondered if my choice would feel like a betrayal to them, whether they would see it as abandonment rather than beginning. The idea pressed against me like a soft weight, not heavy enough to break me but heavy enough to leave an imprint. Outside the window, the night deepened, settling into the house like a quiet witness. The future felt both close and impossibly far. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my fingers trace the lace along the sleeves, each pattern delicate as breath. I imagined walking down the aisle, imagined the soft murmur of guests turning to watch, imagined Elias waiting at the altar with that gentle smile that always eased the tension in my chest. But I also imagined the empty spaces where my children should stand, imagined searching the room for their faces and finding none. That image cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Joy felt complicated when divided, like a light dimmed by shadows of what was missing. Later, I stepped into the hallway and paused outside their doors, listening for even the faintest sign that they might be awake. Both rooms were silent, the kind of silence that feels deliberately constructed, carefully chosen. I almost knocked, almost whispered their names through the wooden barrier, but the moment felt too fragile, too easy to shatter. I didn't want to beg for something that needed to come willingly, so I stood there for a moment longer, letting myself feel the ache rather than run from it, before returning to my room with a heaviness I wasn't sure how to soothe. As midnight approached, I hung the dress carefully and leaned against the wall, closing my eyes to steady the swirl of emotion inside me. I thought of the years I had spent piecing myself back together, learning to feel whole without needing anyone else to hold me up. I thought of how Elias had entered my life quietly, not as a replacement but as a companion, someone who didn't fill my empty spaces but respected them. And I wondered whether my children would ever understand that difference. The question spiraled, soft and persistent. Was I choosing joy at the cost of something irreplaceable? Before slipping under the covers, I whispered one final question into the quiet, the one that had followed me through every decision, every conversation, every moment of doubt. Would I walk down the aisle tomorrow with their blessing or without them entirely? The night didn't answer. It only held the silence gently, like someone trying not to wake a heart already stretched thin. The morning light spilled through the small church windows in long, quiet beams, soft as breath and warm as memory. Dust floated in the air like drifting snowflakes suspended in time, and the wooden floorboards glowed under the early sun. The scent of old hymnals and polished benches filled the room, familiar in a way that made my heart tighten. Guests arrived in gentle murmurs, their footsteps softened by reverence rather than ceremony. And even as I smiled and greeted them, my eyes kept wandering toward the doors, waiting for a glimpse of the two faces I needed most. I stood near the front, holding my bouquet with trembling steadiness, trying to shift my attention to the moment I'd long imagined. But every time the door creaked open, hope sparked too quickly, flaring before fading again when another guest walked through. Elias approached me quietly, his presence calm, his eyes filled with a warmth that should have settled the storm inside me. He took my hand gently, the touch grounding but not answering the question I couldn't silence. Even as he smiled, I could feel the searching in his gaze. He knew who I was hoping to see. The soft hum of conversation built behind us, rising and falling like waves brushing the shore. Yet the quiet ache beneath my ribs only grew heavier. I listened to the rustle of dresses, the shifting of suits, the polite laughter of those unaware of the emptiness pulsing beneath our celebrations. 2 empty seats had been placed near the aisle, their presence both intentional and unbearable. Guests glanced at them from time to time, perhaps wondering who they were meant for. I kept my gaze elsewhere, afraid that looking directly at them would undo whatever fragile composure I had managed to gather. When the ceremony music began, soft piano notes drifting through the air like a gentle call, the room settled into a hush. I walked toward the altar slowly, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, each one pulling me forward and pulling at something tender behind me. Elias stood waiting, hands clasped, expression steady in the way that always made him feel like a safe harbor. When I reached him, he whispered, "You look beautiful," a simple truth spoken with sincerity. I smiled, but my heart carried more weight than any dress could hold. The minister began speaking, his voice warm and measured, weaving words about commitment, trust, and the quiet work of love. I listened, but part of me floated above the moment, hovering somewhere between past and present, loss and hope. My hand rested in Elias's, his thumb brushing gently across my knuckles as if reminding me of the ground beneath my feet. Yet the absence of my children throbbed like a bruise I kept pressing. I wondered if they were still at home, unaware of what this moment meant or too aware to face it. When it was time for the vows, Elias went first, his voice steady, soft, unwavering. He spoke of choosing me not because he needed someone to fill a space but because he recognized in me a quiet strength he wanted to walk beside. His words wrapped around me like a blanket I didn't know I needed, warm and patient. I felt tears gather at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness but from the tender truth of being seen. As he finished, the room seemed to hold its breath, honoring the weight of what he had offered. Then it was my turn. My voice wavered at first, caught between the beauty of the moment and the ache of who wasn't there. I steadied myself, breathing in the scent of the flowers, the wood, the morning light. I spoke of gratitude, of resilience, of choosing love not as a replacement for the past but as a testament to survival. I told him I had learned that joy doesn't erase pain but can sit beside it, quietly, if tended with care. Each word felt like a step forward, even as my heart tugged gently backward. When the final blessing was spoken, a soft stillness settled over the room, warm and sacred. People bowed their heads, closed their eyes, let the moment wash over them. I kept mine open, almost unwilling to blink, as though missing even a second might shift something important. The minister's voice faded into silence, and the congregation lifted their gazes again, smiling with the sweetness of shared celebration. But even in the shared joy, the emptiness of those 2 seats pressed against me like a weight I couldn't shake. As we turned to face the guests, newly married, the applause rose gently, warm and encouraging. Elias squeezed my hand, anchoring me in the present, reminding me that this was still a moment worth holding. Yet my eyes drifted toward the back one more time, hoping against reason for a late arrival, for a soft apology written in footsteps. The door stayed still, its silence wrapped in sunlight. A small tremor of grief threaded through my joy, binding the 2 emotions together in a way I didn't know how to unravel. When we walked down the aisle as husband and wife, the moment felt both full and incomplete, bright and shadowed. The sunlight through the stained glass cast soft colors across the floor, brushing over my dress like blessings painted in light. Guests smiled, reached for our hands, offered words of happiness that I accepted with gratitude. But somewhere inside, a question echoed, fragile and unsteady. Could joy survive when shared with only half the people I loved? As we stepped outside into the morning breeze, the question followed me, soft as breath, persistent as truth. The moment I stepped outside the church, the breeze met me with a softness that felt both like release and like reckoning. It brushed against my dress, lifting the fabric just enough to make everything feel lighter, though my heart hadn't caught up yet. The sunlight was warm but muted, as though the day knew better than to shine too brightly on a moment still stitched with uncertainty. Guests filtered out behind us, laughter and congratulations threading through the air like ribbons trailing in the wind. Yet all of that softened into the background the instant I saw 2 familiar silhouettes standing near the gate. Adil and Sana stood side by side, not dressed for a wedding, not holding flowers or gifts, their posture stiff with the weight of everything unspoken. For a second, I wondered if they might turn away when our eyes met, if their presence was accidental rather than intentional. But they held their ground, even as discomfort flickered across their faces like shadows shifting under sunlight. Sana's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles pale, while Adil's jaw twitched with a tension he didn't bother to hide. They looked like adults carrying the memories of children, uncertain, protective, afraid to take the first step. Elias slowed behind me, sensing without needing to ask that this was a moment meant for us alone. He offered a small, reassuring squeeze of my hand before releasing it, stepping back with quiet dignity. I walked toward my children, each step steady but thick with emotion, as though the air between us held years of unheard apologies and unspoken truths. When I reached them, no one spoke at first. We simply stood there, 3 hearts circling the same ache, each unsure how to reach across it. The silence felt fragile, like a glass bridge we hadn't decided whether to cross. Sanna's eyes glistened as she looked at me, soft, conflicted, holding far more than her trembling lips could express. She moved first, almost imperceptibly, a small shift of weight that signaled hope breaking through her fear. "We didn't know if we should come," she whispered, her voice catching on the edge of uncertainty. I nodded gently, letting her know she didn't need to explain. Her breath hitched as she stepped a little closer, as though approaching me required navigating a terrain she hadn't walked in years. And in that moment, I felt the remnants of the child she once was, the one who clung to my leg during every moment of change. Adil remained still, eyes shifting from me to Elias, then back again, his emotions drawn tight across his features like lines on a map he hadn't learned to read yet. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, raw, carrying the weight of someone who had spent too long trying to protect what he didn't know how to control. He said he still didn't understand everything, still wasn't sure what came next, but he didn't want me to walk out of the church thinking they didn't care. His honesty cracked something in me, a delicate, trembling relief that rose through my chest like a sigh I'd held for years. I didn't scold them, didn't ask where they had been, didn't demand the apologies I once thought I needed. Instead, I opened my arms, simple and steady, offering a space that had always belonged to them no matter how complicated life became. Sana stepped into the embrace first, pressing her cheek against my shoulder with a softness that felt like forgiveness trying to find its shape. Adil joined a moment later, his touch hesitant at first, then firmer as he let himself lean into the moment. The three of us held one another in a circle that felt both fragile and fiercely real. Behind us, Elias watched from a respectful distance, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression gentle and patient. He didn't interrupt, didn't approach, didn't attempt to blend into a moment that wasn't his to claim. His restraint held a kind of love I didn't know I needed, love that understood timing, boundaries, and the delicate work of healing. When our eyes met, he offered me a quiet, steady nod, letting me know he was there without stepping into the space still forming between me and my children. His presence didn't press, it simply stood. As the embrace loosened, the three of us remained close, shoulders brushing, breaths sensing in ways we hadn't shared for months. Adil wiped his eyes quickly, pretending it was the sunlight irritating them, while Sana tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with trembling fingers. We didn't talk about forgiveness, not yet. Some things don't need naming in their first breath. What we shared instead was understanding, tentative but real. The beginning of a bridge built not from certainty but from willingness. The breeze picked up again, carrying with it the faint scent of lilies from the church doorway and the soft rustle of distant conversations. Guests passed by with curious glances, sensing the intimacy of the moment and stepping around it with quiet respect. The world felt lighter, as though the air itself recognized this small shift, this soft beginning woven from old fears and new hope. I exhaled deeply, feeling a peace settle into the spaces that grief had once occupied. My children didn't give me their blessing, not in words, but they gave me their presence. And sometimes that's the beginning of everything. As we started walking back toward Elias, their steps were hesitant but unresisting, carrying the weight of past wounds and the possibility of healing. I felt something shift inside me, not a victory or triumph, but a gentle settling of truths long waiting for acknowledgement. And as we approached the man waiting softly in the sunlight, a question rose in my heart, quiet, thoughtful, tender. Maybe love isn't about who says yes or no. Maybe it's about who stays long enough to understand why.